As we are currently in the heart of Ramadan, one question divides the Abrahamic religions. Who is Jesus? Well, Dr. Mike Licona, professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University, is here to explain why Islam gets Jesus fundamentally wrong. So, Mike, in the Quran, Jesus is mentioned a lot, but what are the main differences between that version and the New Testament version of Jesus?
Well, the New Testament version is that Jesus is God's uniquely divine Son. It's also that Jesus died by crucifixion and that he rose from the dead. The Quran denies all three of those. It denies that he's God's Son. It denies that he died. And of course, if you don't have a death, you don't have a resurrection. So the three things that are some of the most important things about Jesus in the New Testament and that were preached by Jesus' disciples are the very things that the Quran denies about him.
So let's get right after, buddy. Why does Islam get Jesus wrong? And specifically, how do we know?
Well, it's a good question. And, it doesn't really help to just say, look, you've got your book, I've got my book, I think your book's wrong, you think my book's wrong, right? It's more than a matter of faith, the way I like to approach it. I like to say, let's look at the evidence for it. Now, what you have is a book that is composed 600 years after Jesus and is not firsthand testimony, at least as we have it today. What we have is like numerous sources that report, let's say, Jesus' death. Let's just focus on that for a moment. You've got an early oral tradition, a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that can be traced back to the Jerusalem apostles. So it derives from Jesus' apostles. That's one thing. Another thing is we also have unsympathetic and even hostile sources that report Jesus' death. You have Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Bar Serapion. They all talk about his death. We have multiple independent sources. So not only do you have those in the New Testament literature, like all four Gospels, the book of Acts, 1 John, Hebrews, 1 Peter, the letters of Paul that all talk about the death of Jesus, and all these, written by independent authors, even though it appears in a single book of literature that has been compiled into a single volume. But these are, different pieces of literature written by different authors in the New Testament. So you have this oral tradition, you have multiple independent sources in the New Testament, you have these non-Christian sources. You have a low probability of Jesus surviving crucifixion, at least by natural causes. There's only two accounts in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion, and in both cases, they were deliberately removed from their crosses. And we don't have any information further with the one, but in the case of Josephus's friends who were removed, they were provided the best medical care whatsoever. And of the three that were removed, two of them died. So, if Jesus was removed prematurely and medically assisted, for which we don't have a scrap of evidence, his chances of survival, at least by natural causes, would have been extremely low. Now, I've just given you, I think, 4 different historical reasons for thinking Jesus died by crucifixion. All of them are dated to the 1st century, within a few decades of the event. But I'd like to give one more, and that is what I call the Islamic catch-22 argument. And this is more of a theological, kind of a hybrid between theological and historical. We know that Jesus predicted his imminent death. We know this because it appears in multiple independent sources, such as every layer of the gospel tradition, Mark, Q, M, L, and John. It's also it's early. It's in Mark, the earliest gospel, and it's in the Eucharist sayings, an oral tradition that you read in Luke's gospel, as well as Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 9, when it's either 9 or 11, where it's this oral tradition about what Jesus said about, and this is my body, this is my blood. He's talking about his coming death. So I could give you some other reasons as well, but that Jesus predicted his imminent death is well attested historically. Now, this
Mm.
creates a dilemma for Muslims, because if the Quran says that Jesus did not die in Surah 4, verses, I think it's 156 and 157, it says that Jesus did not die. God only made it appear that he did. So if the Quran is correct, then Jesus was wrong because he predicted that he would die in the first century. And therefore, the
Mm.
Quran is wrong that Jesus was a great prophet. But if Jesus did die in imminent death as he predicted, and for which we also have evidence, well, then the Quran is mistaken because it says he didn't. In either sense, the Quran is mistaken. So the only thing I can think of that a Muslim could say in response is they could say, well, Jesus really never predicted his imminent death. And I'd say, well, I've given you several reasons for thinking that he did. Go ahead, give me a reason for not thinking so. Give me a historical reason.
Mm.
And so I think it's Islam does not have much going for it in terms of evidence. But when it comes to Christianity, like in his death, his resurrection, there's a lot of really good evidence for it.
That's really, really helpful, Mike. And you have a book that's this thick called The Resurrection of Jesus, and that would probably take weeks simply to read out loud. So I know this is a tough thing to drill down, but my friend here who comes from, let's say, an Islamic family, a Muslim background, and he's hearing what you're saying, and he's at least open to the idea that, hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the evidence, which is what you're so passionate about, points to the reliability of the New Testament. And you've written about this for forever. In your quickest summary, how do we know that Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay, quick summary. I'd say historians don't agree on all facts, but if we just took those facts that historians do agree on, so I'm talking about atheists, agnostics, Christians, Jews who study this stuff, professional historians, okay, they agree that Jesus died by crucifixion, that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Naturally, the Jewish, the agnostic, the atheist historian they don't think that it was an actual appearance of Jesus, but they still acknowledge, based on the data, that they had some experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Then you've got a skeptic, a persecutor, a Jewish persecutor of the church named Paul. He was, by his own testimony, he was persecuting the church because he believed that it was a cult. And so one day, while he's persecuting the church, he has an experience he believes and interprets as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him, and it radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, I've just given you a number of facts: his death by crucifixion, the appearances or experiences and the disciples, and the experience of Paul, that they all believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. And then finally, you say, what historians do is you look, what's the best explanation to account for those? And all kinds of things have been proposed over time. Disciples lied, they hallucinated, this was a legend, it's a metaphor, they didn't really mean it was Jesus raised from the dead, things like that. But every single one of those can be easily refuted. And the only hypothesis that can adequately explain these undisputed data, these facts that I've given you, is the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead. And therefore, it's pretty cool stuff.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. My friend, if you're watching this and you don't believe that Yeshua of Nazareth rose from the dead, but you know that you need a savior, the deep part of your soul, you know that there's something wrong. And to think, it's not just that there's this like standoff ethos thing. It's that Yeshua, God came, Emmanuel, and took your place in that punishment. It's such it's overwhelmingly beautiful story if you let it resonate with your soul, that God loved you so much. One of my favorite quotes in the entire New Testament is when Jesus looks down to these people that are literally crucifying him, literally giving him the most excruciating, humiliating death the humanity's ever designed. And what does Jesus say? Oh, whew. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And so my encouragement is if you just if it's a family tradition honor thing, I get it. But if it's an evidence apologetics thing, man, I encourage you to read my brother Mike Licona's books. He has a lot of them. Half of my bookshelf is your books, because I want you to know this Yeshua who was raised from the dead. Mike Licona, my friend, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Raj.